Being one of the earliest successful bullpups, the AUG has many forward-thinking, well-thought-out design features. The trigger group is not one of them. We've all heard about the dreaded 12-pound mushy AUG trigger mechanism, also copied by a few other early bullpups like the F2000 and the P90. As a bullpup supremacist, I personally believe this trigger mechanism has done irrevocable damage to the reputation of bullpup firearms. It has given rise to a lot of fuddlores, which are, in my opinion, mistakenly accepted as unavoidable flaws of the bullpup layout. The most popular of these fuddlores is probably need long linkage between trigger and sear, pull trigger, linkage flex, makes mushy trigger. While oversimplified, this notion is kinda true on an AUG, because when you press the trigger, you compress the linkage, which theoretically can cause it to bow out to the side, rubbing on the polymer shell and creating a springy, gritty feel. On other bullpup designs where you pull on the linkage instead of push, the amount of stretch in the linkage is microscopic. However, I think this detail is superficial, just like a lot of other reasons that people attribute to the bad feel of the AUG trigger, like how a lot of the parts are plastic, or the fact that manufacturing tolerance can leave one end of the linkage slightly longer than the other, which would twist the sear side to side as you pull the trigger. In my opinion, the biggest reason the AUG trigger sucks is because the trigger blade, linkage, and sear all slide back and forth instead of pivoting. This means that if you drop the gun on its butt, the total mass of these components, plus the mass of the disconnector as well because it's sitting on the sear, creates a lot of inertia that keeps them moving rearward. Therefore, this design necessitates that the sear spring must be very stiff to resist the inertia of these components. Even if you engage the manual safety, only the trigger blade and linkage are held stationary, whereas the sear is still free to move and can theoretically release the hammer from a harsh enough impact. Let's compare this to a pivoting trigger mechanism. If the trigger and sear pivots around an axle, clever designs can place the center of mass of these components on the pivot, which eliminates the moment arm of the inertial force, meaning no matter how high the inertia, not enough torque can be generated to pivot these components, making the gun much more drop safe. It should be noted that there's a drop safety piece in the trigger mechanism here. But from the looks of this diagram, referencing multiple videos online, and talking to a few people, it looks to me like this drop safety only works when the gun is dropped at an angle varying from muzzle down to grip down, where the high center of mass on this part keeps moving after the drop and rotate the part counterclockwise. To the best of my knowledge, this part does not provide any protection from a drop on the buttstock. However, since the AUG still passed the Austrian military drop test, my theory is that the weight of the sear spring was calculated such that a drop harsh enough to overcome the sear spring would also move the bolt carrier back, which separates the firing pin from the bolt face. So even if the hammer falls, it's not gonna fire the gun. Because of that, one should be cautious that some aftermarket trigger kits for the AUG has parts with more mass and or a lighter sear spring may mess up the timing of these events and turn the gun into an accidental discharginator. To be clear, all of this is just my speculation, but as you can see, the AUG trigger group does not exactly inspire confidence. The other downside of the sliding trigger mechanism instead of a pivoting one is friction. When the sear is holding the hammer spring is almost fully compressed, which generates a high force. The force is transmitted to the sear, and the sear exerts an equal force on whatever is holding it in place, in this case, the crosspin. The reaction force applied from the crosspin to the sear creates a friction force that resists you pulling the trigger. If this were to be a pivoting sear, like for example on the X95, this friction is applied to the surface of the trigger pin, which means the torque created by this friction has the moment arm equal to the radius of the trigger pin, whereas the force pulling on the sear has a much longer moment arm, and because of that, you have a mechanical advantage over the friction. Meanwhile, with the sliding sear of the AUG, you're just raw dogging the friction with no mechanical advantage. At this point, you might be thinking about how the 1911 has a sliding trigger, and it's one of the best triggers ever. Well, the sliding trigger blade on a 1911 does not see any load when the hammer is cocked. All the load, and thus all the friction, is bared by this pivoting sear, and all the stuffs about mechanical advantage applies. And that's the end of the video. I mean, I understand why the AUG trigger pack is designed that way. It's so that it can be easily pulled out the back of the gun during field strip. Also, the fact that the Steyr and disconnector use only one spring, and the progressive trigger mechanism are pretty smart in design. However, the design also inherently subjects the parts to undesirable forces, and the solution to the drop safety issue is also very crude, in the form of a heavy sear spring. All in all, I believe the trigger pack on the AUG is a giant smudge on what is otherwise a very neat gun. Actually, one more thing, life update. If you follow my Instagram, you already know, but I got married about a year ago, and that's why I haven't been making any videos. Ever since I got married, making CAD models and editing videos is not the first thing I want to do in my free time, so from now on, all of my content will likely be this short. Basically, if I think of any interesting details about a certain firearm, I'll share it in a bite-sized video like this. Hope you guys will enjoy. If you want to, you can follow me on Instagram though. I'm marginally more active over there, with even shorter form content. So yeah, thanks for watching. Bye bye.